Good day. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you for Reason to Resist from Toronto, Canada on December 3rd, 2025. For the past 2 weeks, the world has had to endure yet another peace charade orchestrated by the Trump regime. Since November 18th, the anti-imperialist media has descended into what is essentially a feeding frenzy over a 28-point peace plan that was leaked to the press on that day, November 18th. And for this entire time, Reason to Resist has said virtually nothing about this plan and has remained focused on developments in West Asia. We made the decision to ignore the so-called peace plan for 2 reasons. First, we knew immediately that this plan was a fraud. And second, the West and its rabid Israeli attack dog continue to commit genocide in occupied Palestine and are doing everything possible to bury the truth of what they are doing to the Palestinian people. So we felt an obligation to keep the spotlight on occupied Palestine. Today, however, we decided at Reason to Resist to bite the bullet and finally address Trump's 28-point peace plan. Why do we do that? Well, because most commentators in the anti-imperialist media, based on what we can tell, appear to have fallen into the trap of believing that Trump genuinely, sincerely desires an end to the Ukraine war and a durable peace with the Russian people. This, we say, is a dangerous fantasy, and it's one that we're determined to refute. The last thing the world needs is for ordinary citizens, and especially American voters, to be deceived into thinking that Trump wants a lasting peace with Russia, which possesses the world's largest nuclear arsenal. If voters fall prey to this delusion, then they're more likely to support Trump, or at least less likely to oppose him. Whether Trump is serious about ending that war, therefore, has existential implications for all of humanity. So determining Trump's true intentions in Ukraine is of the utmost importance from a journalistic perspective, and getting it right is vitally important. Ever since Trump allowed and enabled Israel to blow up the Gaza ceasefire in March of this year, we've argued that Trump is a genocidal psychopath who could get us all killed. 8 months later, we're more convinced of this than ever. So how did Trump's latest deception operation begin? On November 18th, Axios published what it described as a big scoop about negotiations between the Russian and US governments. And up here you can see the headline from that article. Axios, by the way, has become more or less the go-to platform for fake stories that America's political elite wants to plant in the public discourse. According to Axios, American and Russian officials had been working behind the scenes for weeks on a 28-point US plan. I'm quoting here, inspired by Trump's successful push for a deal in Gaza, close quote. There's nothing successful about it unless you believe that the perpetration of a genocide is success. Now, Axios reported that according to an unnamed US official, Steve Witkoff was leading the drafting of the plan and has discussed it extensively with Russian envoy Kirill Dmitriev. That revelation told us all we needed to know about Trump's latest peace plan. As Steve Witkoff has demonstrated beyond a shadow of a doubt, he's a con man who is intensely loyal to Donald Trump. Not only that, but Witkoff is a war criminal who has enabled Israel's genocide and other heinous crimes in the broader region. No sane person would trust Witkoff to draft a peace plan with a geopolitical rival of the United States, such as the Russian Federation. Witkoff, to put it bluntly, is a shyster who pretended to be negotiating with Iran about its nuclear enrichment program while his boss was preparing, along with Israel, to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities, which constituted crimes against humanity and war crimes. Witkoff is also the shyster who negotiated the first so-called ceasefire in Gaza. That one went into effect in January, around the time that Trump returned to the White House. And Israel used that ceasefire to secure the release of dozens of Israeli prisoners of war, then tore it up and began starving the civilian population of Gaza with Witkoff's enthusiastic support. And worst of all, Witkoff is the shyster who negotiated the current agreement, or at least mediated it. That was the word he used to describe his role, between the Palestinian resistance in Gaza and Israel. Like the ceasefire agreement from earlier this year, Israel used the current agreement to secure the release of the remaining Israeli prisoners of war and also to consolidate its grip over more than 50% of the Gaza Strip. Since the Witkoff brokered ceasefire went into effect on October 11th, Israel has killed Palestinian civilians every single day, an average of approximately 8 to 9 being killed, dozens being wounded. And it has also destroyed more than 1,500 structures in Gaza of the few that remained, and has allowed less than 30% of the agreed amount of aid to enter the devastated Gaza Strip. Witkoff is supposed to be a mediator in this arrangement, as I mentioned, and the mediators are supposed to ensure compliance with the agreement by Israel's genocidal regime. But Witkoff has sought to justify Israel's contemptuous disregard for the latest ceasefire agreement. As a result, and as Amnesty International recently confirmed, the genocide in Gaza continues. Witkoff should not be jet-setting around the world, at taxpayer expense no less. Rather, he should be rotting in a jail cell at The Hague. Quite apart from the fact that Trump put his favorite con man in charge of drafting this so-called 28-point peace plan for Ukraine, Trump's record is that of a bloodthirsty psychopath. That is particularly true when it comes to Ukraine. Will Shriver just published a lengthy article on Substack titled "The Imaginary Peace President." And here you can see the headline from that piece published on November 27th, 2025. In that piece, which I commend to you, and I'll put a link to it in the description to this video, Will Shriver examines Trump's record in regard to three main geopolitical rivals of the United States: China, Russia, and Iran. And I'd like to examine in some detail with you what Shriver has to say about Trump's record in Ukraine, particularly during his first administration. So you'll see here that Shriver writes that between 2017 and 2021, the already commenced preparations of the mother of all proxy armies were expanded and accelerated to an unprecedented degree. Almost 24 covert U.S. intelligence bases were established throughout eastern Ukraine. So this is during the first Trump administration. Large numbers of Ukrainian armed forces personnel were rotated through U.S. NATO training programs. Ukrainian officers were instructed in the use of U.S. NATO communications and intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, ISR. A chain of command was established from Kiev to U.S. NATO headquarters at Ramstein Air Base in Germany. U.S. heavy weaponry was pre-staged in Poland, and preliminary deals were made with former Warsaw Pact countries, many of them now NATO members, to provide legacy Soviet artillery, armor, ammunition, and fighter aircraft to Ukraine. Ukrainian troops were introduced to the use of Javelin anti-tank guided missiles, M77, 155mm howitzers, and HIMARS multiple launch rocket systems. Some of the legacy Soviet aircraft types in the Ukrainian Air Force were modified to carry and launch U.S. NATO missiles. The massive fortification complex in the Donbass region was extended and strengthened. A few thousand U.S. NATO contractors were integrated into the Ukrainian military, with preference given to the hardcore neo-Nazi brigades, who were considered to be the elite units in the Ukrainian armed forces. The strategic focus during the entire Trump 45 administration, says Shriver, was to complete the preparation of the Ukrainian military to attack and crush the Russia-leaning separatists in the Donbass, and to then retake Crimea, which the Russians had seized in the aftermath of the 2014 American-led coup d'etat in Kiev, and which was formally reassimilated into the Russian Federation as a result of an overwhelming popular referendum vote. And by the way, I went there to Crimea during the war in Ukraine and traveled all over the peninsula, and I can tell you that everybody that I met expressed enthusiastic support for the reunion of Crimea with the Russian Federation. Shriver goes on and says Trump has even bragged about the fact that he was the one who began to arm the Ukrainians to a far greater extent than Obama had ever done. And this is factually accurate. What Trump said was, quote, "I was the one that gave the javelins. Remember the famous javelins? That was me. It wasn't Obama. It wasn't Biden. It wasn't anybody else. It was me. And they wiped out a lot of tanks with those javelins." The expression was, Obama gave sheets and I gave javelins. That was a big deal at the time. That was at the beginning when people said, wow, that's something. Well, that was American equipment. Without American equipment, this war would have been over very quickly. And that was a statement that Trump made this year, in fact, as he claimed to want peace in Ukraine on February 26, 2025. And it doesn't stop there, my friends. Shriver continues. This is the irrefutable fact. The Trump 45 administration both hastened and made inevitable the war whose final fuse was lit in early February 2022 when the Ukrainians commenced a broad front artillery escalation against what they claimed to be Donbass militia positions, but which were indistinguishable from random civilian targets. All of these factors combined compelled the Russians to move decisively and sooner than they wanted to extend their strategic depth in the region. All those who claim Trump has no culpability for the war in Ukraine are either ignorant of the abundant objective facts or in denial thereof. Several prominent geopolitical voices were raising the alarm about war in Ukraine even before Victoria Nuland, John McCain, Lindsey Graham et al. Goose-stepped through the streets of conquered Kiev in 2024. Now, I could go on. There's more. Again, I commend this article to you. Unless I missed it, one thing which Will did not mention in his article, which I think is potentially even more important than the provision of lethal military equipment to Ukraine, all the training, all the reinforcement of fortifications under the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, and that is the fact that Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty with the Russian Federation, which was a pillar, a bedrock of nuclear management and disarmament between the Russian Federation and the United States, and did so with no plausible justification, I might add. Returning then to the Axios revelations of November 18th, here's what we knew, or ought to have known, at the moment when news emerged about Trump's latest peace plan for ending the Ukraine war on November 18th of this year. 1, the plan was being drafted by Trump's favorite con man, Steve Witkoff. 2, Trump arguably did more to provoke the Ukraine war than any other U.S. president. 3, Trump is a pathological liar. And 4, despite having the power to end the Ukraine war, and despite having promised repeatedly to end it within 24 hours of returning to the White House, Trump has utterly failed to end the war since returning to the White House 10 months ago, and in fact has escalated it in some respects by, for example, imposing on Russia or on those buyers of Russian oil secondary sanctions that are designed to decimate the important fossil fuel sector of the Russian economy. For all these reasons and more, no one should have taken seriously this ridiculous plan. When I first heard of it, I rolled my eyes in disbelief. How many times, after all, had we seen the ceasefire kabuki theater before? Nevertheless, the anti-imperialist media went hog wild over the plan. Since November 18th, they've talked almost nonstop about it. Even worse, during the past 2 weeks, many of the major anti-imperialist outlets have explicitly promoted the preposterous claim that Donald Trump genuinely wants peace in Ukraine and with the Russian Federation. Well, we say enough is enough. This time, I'm going to name names. And later in this report, I'm going to show you what some of the major analysts in the anti-imperialist media have said about Trump during the past 2 weeks, as I hope to demonstrate these commentators are suffering from a form of what others have coined Trump derangement syndrome. Now, let me pause for a moment there and explain what I understand the syndrome to be. I first heard about it during the first Trump administration, and it was used by people who were skeptics about Russiagate. And they basically used the phrase to deride persons who were opposed to Trump, and particularly people of a liberal orientation, who had a tendency to believe any negative thing that was said about Trump, regardless of the evidentiary basis for the claim. And the primary conspiracy theory that they attacked, by the way, with complete justification, was the claim that Donald Trump was a puppet of Putin, and that he basically won the election in 2016 against the depraved and completely unsympathetic Hillary Clinton, because Russia had hacked the election, in essence. That was the claim. And after millions of dollars and years of investigation, by former FBI Director Robert Mueller. It was utterly disproven, this conspiracy theory. And so many commentators, including the ones that I'm going to talk about later in this episode, quite rightly, as I say, use the phrase Trump derangement syndrome to ridicule the proponents of this theory that Trump was brought to the White House by Vladimir Putin and was his puppet. Now, just after Trump returned to the White House in January of this year, I did a piece on Reason to Resist in which I talked about Trump derangement syndrome and the origins of it, and the fact that I agreed with those who used it to ridicule the proponents of the Russiagate hoax. But I also pointed out in that piece that there is another form of Trump derangement syndrome. Whereas liberals tend to believe every bad thing that is said about Trump, no matter how unsubstantiated or even preposterous it may be, there are others who cling to positive views about Trump, or at least certain aspects of his character and his agenda, even though there's absolutely no evidence to support that view, and oftentimes there's a mountain of evidence to undermine it. So basically, Trump derangement syndrome, my friends, is a two-sided coin. And I fear that there is ample evidence today that it is influencing or affecting the judgment of people in the alternative media, the anti-imperialist media, who are otherwise fine journalists and excellent analysts. But on this particular point, namely the question of whether Trump really desires to bring an end to the Ukraine war and to have a durable peace with the Russian Federation, they seem to have taken leave of their senses. Now, let's take a closer look at this 28-point plan, the terms of which, as I say, were leaked a day or two after the initial Axios article on November 18th. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to discuss every one of the 28 points. Rather, I'm going to highlight those parts of the plan which made it inevitable, I argue, that Russia would reject it. So first of all, let's look at what the plan had to say about territories. Point 21, Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk will be recognized as de facto Russian, including by the United States. Kherson and Zaporozhye will be frozen along the line of contact, which mean de facto recognition along the line of contact. Russia will relinquish other agreed territories and controls outside the 5 regions. And just pausing there, Russian forces are currently occupying or controlling parts of Sumy region, the Kharkov region, and also Dnipro. And finally, point 21 says Ukrainian forces will withdraw from the part of Donetsk Oblast that they currently control, and this withdrawal zone will be considered a neutral demilitarized buffer zone, internationally recognized as territory belonging to Russian Federation. Russian forces will not enter this demilitarized zone. So first of all, it seems to me that there is an inherent contradiction in these 4 points. As I mentioned in the first 2 bullets, the plan speaks of de facto Russian recognition, de facto of Russian control of Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk, not de jure, but de facto, and then says at the same time that Kherson and Zaporozhye will be frozen along the line of contact, which will mean de facto recognition along that line of contact. But then it talks about, in the 4th bullet, international recognition of Russian control over the territory that has been assigned to the Russian Federation. So which is it? Is it formal recognition with legal effect by the international community, including the United States and Western European states, of Russian sovereignty over these lands? Or is it simply a recognition of de facto control? It's one or the other, but this plan incoherently speaks to both. But whatever the intention is behind the use of the phrase de facto, the bottom line is this: the Russian Federation has been absolutely crystal clear that it will not accept anything less than complete sovereignty, de jure recognition, and de facto control over all of those 4 oblasts: Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye. They have been absolutely adamant about this, and just on this basis alone, it was quite likely that the Russian Federation would reject this 28-point peace plan. But it gets much worse than that. So let's see now what the the plan had to say about security guarantees. Now, remember that Russia has been adamant that Ukraine cannot be a de facto or de jure member of NATO. And in fact, there's plenty of evidence that that was the primary cause of this devastating conflict. It was the insistence by the coup regime in Kiev and its backers in the West, going all the way back to 2008, before Zelensky came to power, that Ukraine would become a member of NATO. And many, luminaries in the foreign policy community in the West, like William Perry and George Kennan, recognized that this was a disastrous policy and would provoke Russia and potentially lead to serious military conflict. And the West pressed ahead with it nonetheless. So that was the background to this 28-point peace plan. What does this say, point 5, the plan? It says Ukraine will receive reliable security guarantees. Update, a separate document details the terms of the security guarantee. The U.S. and its NATO allies would treat an attack on Ukraine as an attack on the entire transatlantic community. Well, folks, that sounds exactly like, or even stronger potentially, depending upon the precise wording ultimately chosen to implement this part of the plan. That sounds like Article 5 of the NATO treaty. And there's simply no prospect whatsoever that Russia would ever accept this. The Article 5 type protection offered by NATO states to Ukraine, even if Ukraine is formally left outside of the NATO architecture. And in addition, point 6 of the plan stipulates the size of the Ukrainian armed forces will be limited to 600,000 personnel. They're calling that a limit. 600,000 personnel would, I'm pretty sure, make Ukraine the largest army in the European continent, to the west of the Russian border. And the reports that I've seen were that in April of 2022, when the Russian Federation and the Ukrainians were on the verge of a deal that would not have required Ukraine to cede any territory to Russia, but did directly address the question of Ukraine membership and the demilitarization of NATO. This was, as you may recall, the deal which Boris Johnson, at the behest of Biden, came to Kiev to rip up and undermine. That deal stipulated that Ukraine's army would have far less than 600,000 soldiers. The number that I've seen is a little less than 100,000. So, and note at the bottom, Ukraine's army here on the screen, you'll see Ukraine's army currently has 800 to 850,000 personnel and had around 250,000 before the war, according to a Ukrainian official. So this so-called limit of 600,000 personnel would make the Ukrainian army more than twice as large as the army that existed at the time that the Russian special military operation began. So I can say with a lot of confidence, as would anybody who's been paying careful attention to the statements of the Russian Federation's government over the past 18 plus months, in fact, going back all the way to 2008, that this is a non-starter for the Russian Federation. Now, what does the deal have to say about the $300 billion or so of Russian central bank funds that have been frozen by European states? Well, they say that point 14 says 100 billion in frozen Russian assets will be invested in US-led efforts to rebuild and invest in Ukraine. That's a lot of dough. And you may say that Russia should pay that and more. You can make that argument. But here's the thing, folks. The Russians will never accept it. They regard all of that money as their money. And they have been clear that they consider the confiscation of those funds to be outright theft by Western governments. And a lot of people in the world agree with them. And I want to just say, and pausing here for a moment, that you can, if you're being objective, you should have some sympathy for their position, because after all, Western states have been running roughshod over international law for decades. Let's just look at for example, the Bush-Cheney-Blair criminal war of aggression on Iraq, which was based upon a pack of lies that Iraq had WMD. Iraq was no threat whatsoever to the British and the Americans, whereas the Russians had good reason to feel threatened by the Ukrainians, who were right on their doorstep, had a sizable army, and were rapidly integrating into NATO, an aggressive military alliance. which collectively has by far the world's largest military budget. So despite the fact that the Bush-Cheney-Blair axis of evil, destroyed Iraq in a criminal war of aggression, there were no efforts whatsoever made on the part of any Western states to seize state funds held in Western financial institutions by Britain or by the United States. That was not even a subject of discussion. And let's look at the case of Israel. Israel has been committing a genocide before the eyes of the world for 2+ years and was committing apartheid long before that. Western governments have not even talked about, let alone attempted, to seize funds of the Israeli state that are held in Western financial institutions. So if you're Russians looking at this, you'd say, look, this is just outright theft. And the pretexts being given for seizing this money are just that. They are hypocritical pretexts. At the end of the day, there's no reason to believe that Russia would accept this provision, and plenty of reason to believe that it would reject it out of hand. And finally, the fourth point I want to show you from this 28-point peace plan is the equivalent to the peace board under the Gaza ceasefire. Point 27 says this agreement will be legally binding. Its implementation will be monitored and guaranteed by the Peace Council headed by President Trump. Sanctions will be imposed for violations. Trump and his government, they are a party to this war. They have no business presiding over any peace plan. If you're going to have anybody who's going to be any kind of an arbiter of an agreement between the Russian Federation on one hand and Ukraine and its Western backers on the other, it would have to be people who've had no involvement in this war and have maintained a studiously neutral position. And preferably, it would be an international organization like the United Nations that would oversee it. The idea that this psychopath, Donald Trump, this war criminal, would be charged with ensuring compliance with this agreement is quite frankly laughable. And again, there's zero prospect that the Russian Federation would accept this provision. Now, any one of these four shortcomings in the 28-point peace plan could have been and likely would have been a deal breaker for Russia. But the four of these fatal flaws put together made it absolutely inevitable that Russia would reject this plan. Anyone who was listening, truly listening, to representatives of the Russian government over the past 18 months would have known this. But it gets worse. It soon became apparent after November 18th that the 28-point peace plan was not a formal offer to the Russian Federation. Rather, the Trump regime viewed it as a starting point for negotiation with Ukraine, as if it regards Ukraine as a sovereign state whose government has the final word on whether a deal with Russia will be struck. This, too, is total nonsense. Ukraine is in every way, shape, or form a protectorate and a dependency of the United States. It's entirely dependent on the United States for its economic functioning. It's entirely dependent upon the United States for military intelligence. The United States has the most sophisticated ISR in the world. It uses its extensive network of satellite and surveillance technologies to locate Russian military assets and Russian personnel on the ground, and it conveys that information to Ukraine's military. It provides targeting data to Ukraine's military. It has provided massive amounts of weaponry, by far more weaponry than any other country in the world. And in fact, even though the Europeans stupidly have begun to pay for the weaponry that the United States is providing, ultimately that weaponry is coming from the United States. And there is no way in hell that Ukraine would last even a month on the battlefield if the United States were to withdraw all economic, military, and intelligence support. The Ukrainians know this. The Americans know this, the Europeans know this, and any person with a functioning brain understands this perfectly well. On top of all of that, Zelensky is in an extraordinarily weak position because his term expired in May of last year. He now is not the legitimate president of Ukraine. He is deeply unpopular. He rules by martial law, by autocratic decree. He has led his country to disaster. And he is now embroiled in what is likely the biggest corruption scandal of his entire political career, with the people closest around him being directly accused of a massive corruption scheme, and his right-hand man, Timur Mindich, being tipped off and fleeing from Ukraine to the genocidal Israeli entity just hours before he was to be arrested by Ukrainian authorities. So a person who is in such a weak condition at the head of a country which is so dependent upon the United States has absolutely no leverage, zero leverage in his dealings with the White House. So the idea that the Ukrainian government is sovereign, that it has the power to nix this deal, is really, frankly, an insult to our intelligence. Ukraine, moreover, and this is something that for which I have a bit of a bee in my bonnet. I've been listening for nearly 4 years that this war is going on to NATO propagandists say that Ukraine has a right to choose to seek admission and obtain admission to NATO if it so elects. This is patently false. And all you got to do is read the NATO treaty to understand this. I'm going to show you NATO Article 10, the NATO Treaty Article 10. The parties may, by unanimous agreement, invite any other European state in a position to further the principles of this treaty to contribute to the security of the North Atlantic area and to accede to this treaty. So the operative phrase here, which I've highlighted, is by unanimous agreement. This means that any one member, even the smallest NATO member, could veto the admission of Ukraine or any other state to the NATO military alliance. And the United States not only has a veto, but it is also by far the most powerful and dominant member of the NATO military alliance. And the idea that Ukraine could enter NATO, both as a matter of fact and as a matter of law, if the United States opposed its admission, is quite simply ridiculous. The United States could give the Russian Federation ironclad assurances that Ukraine will not be admitted to NATO, even if Ukraine wanted desperately to be admitted to NATO, simply by entering into a binding agreement, a treaty, ratified treaty with the Russian Federation, obliging the United States to veto and to oppose in every other way Ukraine's admission to NATO. And if the United States did that and complied with its obligations under the treaty with Russia, that would be the end of the matter. Ukraine could squawk until the cows come home. The European vassals of Washington could complain bitterly. There's absolutely nothing that Ukraine could do at that point. And so the question arises, why hasn't the Trump regime given those ironclad assurances to the Russian Federation if it's truly interested in a lasting peace? Now, despite the Trump regime's ability to dictate to the Ukrainian regime, the Zelensky regime, the terms of a final settlement with the Russian Federation, we were treated to a spectacle in Florida after this 28-point plan was revealed to the public of Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, along with the con man, Steve Witkoff, and his sidekick con man, Jared Kushner, meeting with senior Ukrainian officials for the purpose of trying to secure their agreement to the 28-point peace plan, when it was entirely open to Donald Trump to compel them to accept the terms of this plan. And by the way, it's curious that Jared Kushner has resurfaced in these negotiations, and he's begun to assume a rather prominent role in the Trump regime, just as he did during the first Trump administration. I don't know exactly what all of that means. I had started to wonder whether he had simply been consigned to the bleachers, but it appears that he's been exercising significant degrees of influence in this administration all along. Now, after the meeting in Florida, neither side released much detail about what, if anything, was agreed, but Rubio said the meeting had been very productive. Critically, at the same time, Rubio admitted that, quote, much work remains to be done. This was a clear signal that Ukrainian officials had not agreed to the 28-point peace plan. Again, something which was entirely predictable based upon the consistent maximalist positions taken by Volodymyr Zelensky, no matter how terrible the situation may be for his country and for the armed forces of Ukraine on the battlefield. After this pointless gathering in Florida, Witkoff flew to Russia for another pointless meeting with President Putin. This was the sixth such meeting between the con man and the Russian president. They met at the Kremlin yesterday, December 2nd. After that meeting, the Kremlin's top foreign policy aide, Yuri Ushakov, told the press that talks between President Putin and U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff had been useful, but that, quote, no compromise plan, close quote, has been found yet following the hours-long meeting in Moscow. And here you can see a report from U.S. media specifying that, in effect, these discussions in Moscow were a failure. None of this was surprising, of course. The failure of these fake negotiations was as predictable as the sunset. Some of you may be asking, if this 26-point peace plan was a charade, then why did Russia engage in the charade? Why did it humor the U.S. government? I don't think that's particularly difficult to understand. There are a lot of people in Russia, I think this is true of people around the world, who don't like war. They don't want war to continue. They like to avoid it. And they would very much prefer that this one be brought to an end. And although the polls show that a large majority of the Russian population continue to support Russian President Vladimir Putin and the Russian military, and a significant majority seem to feel that the job needs to be carried through to its completion, I think a lot of Russian people would be less supportive of the Russian government and quite possibly hostile to the Russian government if they felt that the Russian government was not at least making an effort to engage in discussions with the Americans, especially when the Americans are at least superficially offering an olive branch to the Russian president. And so I think for purposes of appearances, even though the Russians probably understand perfectly well at this stage that the US government can't be trusted and they're not serious about peace, they are nonetheless keeping the door open in order to show to the Russian people that they're willing to talk. And I think also it's not just the Russian people they want to persuade that they're willing to talk, it's people in the global south, and it's their allies, particularly the People's Republic of China and other members of the BRICS. They want to know that the Russians are willing to talk. And finally, quite apart from all of that, quite apart from the necessity of demonstrating a willingness to at least talk to the enemy, as I mentioned at the outset, as we all know, Russia and the United States have enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world many times over. And the maintenance of an ongoing dialogue between the two governments is likely to reduce the risk of a nuclear conflagration, whereas doing what Biden did with the full backing of his European vassals, which was to say completely cutting off any kind of civilized communication with the enemy, that was heightening the risk of a catastrophic eruption of nuclear war. So that too is a compelling reason why the Russians would continue to talk to the Americans, even though they know perfectly well that Donald Trump, as I believe they do, is not genuinely interested, at least not at this stage, in a durable peace with the Russian Federation, and that he can't be trusted either. So as all of this unfolded, what have the large, prominent anti-imperialist platforms been saying about Trump's agenda? As far as I can tell, most of them, and perhaps a vast majority of them, continue to cling to the fantasy that Trump genuinely desires to end the Ukraine war. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to identify all of them. I'll confine my observations to four. But I want to be clear before I talk about these specific platforms, these commentators and analysts, that they're not alone in promoting the illusion that Trump genuinely wants peace with Russia. And I also want to make a couple of disclaimers about what I'm about to say about those platforms. First of all, every one of the commentators whom I'm going to talk about in a moment are people whom I respect. It doesn't mean I agree with everything that they have to say, but and I'll tell you right up front, one of them is Glenn Greenwald. I think that Glenn Greenwald is a giant of journalism today. One of the most outstanding and accomplished journalists and bravest journalists, certainly in the Western world, if not globally. And I don't necessarily agree with Glenn on everything, but I agree with him on many, many points. And I don't want anything that I say about him or the other commentators about whom I'm going to speak to be taken as a rejection of their journalism, as a mark of disrespect. We can all have civilized disagreements. This is a very important point, the question of whether Donald Trump genuinely desires an end to the Ukraine war and a durable peace with the Russian Federation. And simply because I take issue with them and strongly take issue with them on this particular point, I'll continue to watch them and continue to recommend them as fine analysts. Nobody's perfect, neither am I. And I'm sure there may be things I've said over time with which they disagree. And that's the nature of what we do as anti-imperialist journalists. The other thing I want to stress before I talk about what they've said about this 28-point peace plan, I want to point out that there is an important distinction between a durable peace agreement and a ceasefire. And I don't contest that Donald Trump may want a ceasefire, a temporary suspension of hostilities. But if he does want that, I'm not even convinced that he wants that much. He wants that based on all the evidence so that Ukraine can rearm, mobilize more soldiers, train those soldiers, and rebuild the fortifications, many of which have been destroyed or taken by the forces of the Russian Federation. Many of the best fortifications are now under the control. Ukrainian fortifications are now under the control of Russian forces. So there's an urgent need on the part of the Ukrainian military, if it's to have any hope whatsoever of stemming the tide of the Russian advance, for a cessation of hostilities, at least for a significant period of time, so that it can do all of those things. And I think that may well be what Trump wants. But that's very different from wanting to bring the war to an end. It's very different from a durable peace. And it's something that the Russians would never accept. Why would they? It would be utterly irrational and contrary to the interests of their people when they're steamrolling the Ukrainian military, as they now are doing, all along the front line, for them to give the Ukrainian forces a break and allow them to rearm. They would be imperiling the lives of their own soldiers over the long run were they to do that. So does Trump want a ceasefire? That may well be the case, but that's very different from him wanting a peace. And it's important for us to recognize that distinction and to talk about it when we analyze the behavior of Donald Trump and his surrogates. So with those two disclaimers, let's start by listening to Glenn Greenwald's take on the latest peace charade. The clip I'm going to show you was published by Glenn on November 26 and was entitled "Disturbing Leak of Witkoff Call." And this requires a little bit of explanation, this clip. What basically happened, the background to this report is that about 1 week ago, Bloomberg published a transcript of an alleged conversation between Witkoff and President Putin's foreign policy advisor, Yuri Ushakov. Most observers seem to think that the conversation was secretly monitored by a U.S. intelligence agency and that someone within that agency leaked the transcript to Bloomberg to make Witkoff and Trump look bad. According to this theory, Witkoff was coaching Ushakov on how to pitch a peace deal to Trump to make Trump's acceptance of the deal more likely. And by leaking the transcript to Bloomberg, people inside the deep state who are opposed to peace with Russia sought to embarrass Donald Trump. According to Greenwald, Americans should be deeply concerned that the U.S. deep state is monitoring close aides to the president and leaking conversations of those aides with foreign officials for the purpose of undermining a peace initiative by the U.S. president. Now, in fact, if that's what happened, then I completely agree with Glenn Greenwald that Americans should be very concerned about this leak. But is that really what happened? So here's Greenwald's take on this leak.
Steve Witkoff is the person on whom President Trump most relies, who he most trusts, to negotiate peace deals. He's known Witkoff forever. Witkoff's a New York real estate billionaire like Trump. They go back a long way. He trusts Witkoff completely. And he tasked Witkoff to try and negotiate the deals, the two ceasefire deals that President Trump was able to engineer between Israel and the Palestinians in Gaza. And now Witkoff has been tasked to work on a peace deal between the Russians and the Ukrainians to end the war, which is one of the President Trump's top foreign policy priorities.
Let's just stop there. These are key words. ending the war, not pausing the war, not suspending the war, but ending the war, according to Glenn, is one of Trump's top foreign policy priorities. And let me be clear, I couldn't disagree with that statement more, but let's hear the rest of what Glenn has to say in this clip.
Even though so many Republicans, even his own Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and most of the deep state oppose this plan, that is the elected president's policy.
And so he goes on, obviously, not only to repeat that that is the president's policy, but basically to suggest, not suggest, to state outright that to the extent there's been a failure to achieve that policy, it's because of people inside the deep state and inside Donald Trump's own administration. And he continues and says the following.
And as part of his work for the president, Witkoff was speaking to top-level Russian officials and a Western intelligence agency, if probably the NSA, maybe the British counterparts, spied on those conversations, created transcripts of Steve Witkoff's conversations with Russian officials that were geared toward facilitating a peace deal with Ukraine that many people inside the US government want to sabotage, and then leaked the contents of those telephone calls to Bloomberg, which then published it. Steve.
Okay, so he clearly is saying, Glenn, here, and I think it's clear from the entirety of the report that he put out on this day, that the transcript of the conversation between Ushakov and Witkoff reveals that Witkoff was trying to do the job that he has supposedly been assigned by Trump, which is to bring an end to the Ukraine war. But I question whether, in fact, that is a fair interpretation of the transcript. And furthermore, he clearly believes, Glenn, that it was a U.S. intelligence agency, probably the NSA, that leaked this transcript. He does raise the possibility that it might have been British intelligence, but he excludes the possibility, apparently doesn't even think it's worth mentioning, that it might have been a Russian source that leaked the transcript. Perhaps it was Russian intelligence with the approval of Putin and maybe even the knowledge of Ushakov that recorded the conversation and then decided for some reason to leak it. So let's have a closer look at what the transcript says Witkoff and Ushakov said to each other in this conversation. So I'm not showing you the whole transcript. You can find it on Bloomberg if you can get behind the paywall. But in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on the part that I think is most important. So Witkoff, who's identified as SW in this transcript, says, "Hi, Yuri. Yuri, yeah, Steve. Hi, how are you?" It looks to me like, I don't know, Witkoff called Yuri. And Yuri says, "I'm okay. Congratulations, my friend. Thank you." And then Yuri says, "You made a great job, just a great job. Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you." So at that stage, it's not clear what job he's referring to, but then he goes on. Witkoff says, "Thank you, Yuri, and thanks for your support. I know your country supported it, and I thank you. Yes, 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 you know that's why we suspend the organization of the first Russian-Arabic summit." And Witkoff says, yes. So the Russian-Arabic summit was supposed to be leaders of Arabic states coming to Moscow in mid-October, and based on all reports, all accounts, a primary objective of this meeting was going to be to try to restore stability and some measure of peace to the region of West Asia. So what they're clearly talking about here, it seems to me, and I think this is going to become more apparent as we read the rest of this transcript. They're talking about the Gaza peace deal, okay? And let's remember that although the Russian Federation and the Chinese, the People's Republic of China did not veto that resolution 2803, which was heavily promoted by Trump and supported by the other members of the Security Council, they abstained. They didn't vote in favor of it. They were the only two that didn't vote in favor of it. And publicly, they were quite critical of this peace plan and even said, it's going to fail, and don't say we didn't warn you. So I don't know what he means by support. Witkoff when he talks about the Russian Federation's attitude towards this so-called peace plan for Gaza, but publicly at least, the Russian Federation was not saying anything supportive. And clearly this conversation has taken place, it seems to me, after the UN Security Council adopted this resolution that was heavily promoted by Trump. And then Yushkov goes on and he says, after talking about the suspension of the first Russian-Arabic summit in mid-October, he says, we think that you are making the real job there in the region. Well, I'm not sure what he means by real job. Then Witkoff says, well, listen, I'm going to tell you something. I think if we can get the Russian-Ukraine thing solved, everybody will be jumping for joy. Yuri, yeah, you need to solve only one problem. Witkoff says, what? Yuri says, Russian-Ukrainian war. And then Witkoff says this, I know, how do we get that solved? My friend, I just want your advice. Do you think that it will be useful if our bosses will talk on the phone? Now, Yushkov is not saying, my boss wants to talk to your boss. He's just saying, do you think it'd be useful if they talk to each other? And Witkoff says, yes, I do. Yuri, you do, and when you think it could be possible. Witkoff, I think as soon as you suggest, my guy is ready to do it. Okay, Yuri, here's what I would do, my recommendation. Yes, please. Now, these are the key words. Witkoff, I would make the call and just reiterate that you congratulate the president on this achievement, that you supported it. That you respect that he is a man of peace, and you're really glad to have seen it happen. So I would say that I think from that it's going to be a really good call. Because let me tell you what I told the president. I told the president that the Russian Federation has always wanted a peace deal. That's my belief. I told the president I believe that, and I believe the issue is that we have two nations that are having a hard time coming to a compromise, and when we do, we're going to have a peace deal. I'm even thinking that maybe we set out like a 20-point peace proposal, just like we did in Gaza. We put a 20-point Trump plan together that was 20 points for peace, and I'm thinking maybe we do the same thing with you. My point is this. Okay, my friend, I think that very point our leaders could discuss. Hey, Steve, I agree with you that he will congratulate. He will say that Mr. Trump is a real peace man, and so that he will say. So what Witkoff is trying to do is to get the Russians to support what Trump has done in Gaza. And in order to incentivize them to support what Trump has done in Gaza, which is an absolute abomination, Witkoff is dangling the carrot of a conversation with the president. I don't think that this demonstrates one iota that Witkoff is genuinely trying to achieve a lasting peace in Ukraine. To me, what this suggests is that Witkoff is trying to get the Russians to publicly support the peace deal, put the president in a position where he can say the Russians are on board with the Gaza peace deal. Whatever they may have said at the UN Security Council, they like the Gaza peace deal, this abomination. Well, he wouldn't call it that, of course. It's the greatest peace deal in the history of peace deals. It's brought, a lasting and durable peace to the region of the Middle East for the first time in millennia, and blah, blah, blah. It seems to me that basically the con man Witkoff is trying to sucker the Russians into, conveying to the world that this abominable, really what is a plan that puts Hitler in charge of Auschwitz. That's what the so-called Gaza peace plan is. That this abominable thing is good for peace in the region. It certainly doesn't provide any evidence, no real credible evidence, in my opinion, this transcript, that Witkoff is serious or that Donald Trump is serious about ending the Ukraine war on durable terms that the Russian Federation can accept. And I have to say, I'm a bit baffled as to why Glenn Greenwald interpreted the transcript as he did. And I would also say that I entertain the possibility that the Russian Federation intelligence leaked this transcript. I think that is a serious possibility. I don't purport to know, but they might have done that simply for the purpose of showing to the world what a duplicitous con man Steve Witkoff actually is. Now, let me move on to the next anti-imperialist commentator who has expressed the view quite affirmatively that Donald Trump really wants a lasting peace in Ukraine. And that commentator is the one and the only, the estimable George Galloway. Here's what he had to say on November 27th on the mother of all talk shows. In his monologue, it was titled, "The Man Who Butchered the Turkey is Marco Rubio."
Thanksgiving, but the question of who is the turkey is still an open one. The deadline given by Donald Trump to Volodymyr Zelensky was tomorrow, Thanksgiving. And if he didn't want to sign up to the Donald Trump peace deal, then he could, and I quote the president, fight his little heart out. Well, that was a clear enough indication that Trump was pulling stumps, was saying this far and no further. This war has got to end. But it isn't. And the deadline has been missed. And I'm going to argue the probably unpopular line that the turkey in this picture is not the one that was pardoned there by Donald Trump. It's definitely not the snow-colored one in that picture, the one that's basted and glazed in the Oval Office just a few months ago, told he had no cards, told that he shouldn't have started a war that he couldn't finish. It's not anyone other than Donald Trump. What do I mean by that? First of all, it requires you to bear with me when I say that I genuinely believe that Donald Trump is trying to bring an end to the war in Ukraine. I genuinely believe that the peace plan, 28 points that he drew up following the Anchorage summit between him and President Putin was a decent and genuine effort to bring the war to an end. I believe the man that butchered the turkey is Marco Rubio.
Now, George Galloway could not have been clearer in expressing the view that Donald Trump really, really, really wants to end the war in Ukraine. And my question to George would be, and I'd be happy to discuss this with him, what is your evidence for that belief? And in particular, how can you be so confident? You don't seem to have any real doubt about whether Donald Trump wants a durable peace in Ukraine. Is it simply the fact that Donald Trump has said this over and over again? Is that it? Since when do we take the mad utterances of this genocidal lunatic seriously? If he has demonstrated anything over the course of his life, not just his political career, but his business career, he's a pathological liar. So unless his statements, his expressions of desire are backed up by concrete action that is consistent with his expressions of desire, there's simply no reason to believe him. And this whole time, while he's been in office, he has been providing massive amounts of weaponry to Ukraine. He has been upping the sanctions on the Russian Federation. He has continued to provide military intelligence to Ukraine. He has not given Russia the ironclad assurances which the US government can give that without Ukraine's cooperation, that Ukraine will never become a member of NATO. He's not done any of those things. He's done the exact opposite. So where's the evidence, George, that Donald Trump actually genuinely wants peace? His words, that's it? You got anything else? And this theory, which is very common, and to be fair to George, and I have, again, great respect for George Galloway. On most things, I am in enthusiastic agreement with him, and I think he makes every single day extremely valuable contributions to the public discourse. I think he's a man of great moral courage, but that doesn't make him perfect. No one is. And this theory that Marco Rubio is, stabbed the turkey Donald Trump, and he's the impediment along with other neocons, bloodthirsty neocons in the deep state, just doesn't make any sense. I'm quite sure that Marco Rubio doesn't want peace with Russia and would like to continue this war. Of that I have no doubt. I have no doubt that there are many people inside the Trump administration who feel that way. I have no doubt that, many people, probably the vast majority of people inside the U.S. deep state feel that way. On those points, I'm in agreement with George Galloway. But the question is this: if that's what Marco Rubio is doing, if he's stabbing the turkey, Donald Trump, and undermining a key foreign policy initiative of the Trump administration, why doesn't Donald Trump fire him? Like, are you suggesting that Donald Trump has had hesitation in the past of exercising his executive authority to fire a senior member of his administration? Didn't he do that repeatedly in the course of his first administration? And if this is the kind of person, if Marco Rubio's views about the war in Ukraine are profoundly contrary to the objectives of Donald Trump, why did Donald Trump appoint him to the position in the first place? Let's recall that when Trump sought the Republican nomination in 2015, he relentlessly belittled Rubio, calling him Little Marco and mocking his propensity to sweat and his prodigious use of makeup. So it's not like, Donald Trump is enamored of Little Marco. And it's not like Donald Trump would have any hesitation of firing anybody who's undermining his agenda. And why did Donald Trump put him there to begin with if Marco Rubio had a radically different view about the desirability of ending the Ukraine war? All of this, my friends, strikes me as highly implausible. And frankly, I just don't get it. And I'll come back a little later to why I think. I'll offer you some speculation about why these eminent commentators in the anti-imperialist media seem to be getting this so wrong. Let's turn to a third example of an anti-imperialist media outlet embracing the narrative that Donald Trump really, really, really wants peace in Ukraine. And this is Daniel Davis, former lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army. And on the several days ago, he published a report in which he addressed the entire question of what Trump is trying to achieve. Here's what he had to say.
Ukraine is short on manpower. They're short on ammunition. The entire West, writ large, is short on the key ammunition parts, especially interceptor missiles, offensive missiles, artillery, armored vehicles of all the different categories, and really anything else, to include even drones. All the stuff that you can put together, most importantly, including the manpower, are on the deficiency side, on the Ukraine side, and on the Russian side. As we've talked about many times, everything is on the top. Manpower, most importantly, defense industrial base, ammunition supplies, stockpiles, missiles, drones, fighter jets, everything you can imagine, air defense systems, much, much more robust on the Russian side and growing. So you would just not expect that the guy who President Trump is trying to get this war over with in this 28-point peace plan, the one who could benefit the most from the war coming to a rapid end, is the one who is now boisterous in saying, no, we're going to keep fighting until we get all these things that we want, even though he has no power to bring it into fruition. So that's kind of the context that this is going in. And one of the reasons why the Trump administration is having such a hard time trying to bring this thing to a head and to try to bring it to fruition, because of resistance, not from the Russian side. We're going to get to that in a minute, but from the Western side, and especially the Ukraine side.
So here you have Daniel Davis saying quite clearly, he said, one of the reasons why Trump is having so much difficulty bringing this to a head is because of resistance on the Ukrainian side. This presupposes that the Ukrainian side actually has leverage in its dealings with Donald Trump. It has zero leverage in its dealings with the United States government. It is utterly beholden to the United States government. And as I said, purely as a legal technical matter, the United States government could put to bed once and for all the Zelensky regime's insistence on being admitted, having Ukraine admitted to NATO, simply by entering into a binding agreement with the Russian Federation that the US government would veto any such admission. So it simply strains credulity that the real obstacle here to a peace deal is Zelensky. The real obstacle to a peace deal, Daniel, is unfortunately Donald Trump himself. For all of the reasons I've articulated, There's no reason to think that Donald Trump's expressions of desire for peace in Ukraine are sincere, and there's a mountain of evidence that they are utterly insincere. So this brings me to the fourth and final clip I want to share with you from the anti-imperialist media. And this is an excerpt from a recent episode of The Duran with Alex Christoforou and Alexander Mercouris. On December 1st, right after Ukrainian officials met with Rubio, Kushner, and Witkoff in Florida, the Duran published a report titled, quote, "Bizarre Negotiations in Intel Back Channels," close quote. In that report, Alex Christoforou and Alexander Mercouris analyzed the meeting in Florida and its implications for Trump's latest peace initiative. And from my perspective, their discussions began in a very promising way. But then things quickly went south. So let's hear what they had to say at the outset with respect to the question of what this meeting in Florida was all about.
Joe said that there's a lot of work that still needs to be done, and we are getting early reports which claim that Ukraine refuses NATO neutrality with NATO. They refuse the withdrawal of troops. They demand a ceasefire along the current front lines. I just find the whole exercise, Alexander, very interesting. The United States pretending to negotiate with a country that they basically control from top to bottom. I mean, the whole thing is theater, kabuki theater. Can you call it that? I mean, if the United States really wanted to impose its will.
Yeah, you nailed it. You nailed it, brothers. Keep going.
On Ukraine, it could do it like that, right?
Yes.
I mean, so why this exercise? Why these theatrics? Why does Rubio say that what's most important to us is to negotiate with Ukraine and to leave it in a position where not only the conflict has ended, but Ukraine can be a sovereign nation? Ukraine lost its sovereignty in 2014, maybe even earlier than that. Yeah. But they definitely lost it during the coup.
Yeah, they did indeed. You know, it was so refreshing to hear the two of them. They were in complete agreement on this point that what we witnessed in Florida was kabuki theater. I think that is absolutely true. The idea that Ukraine can stand in the way of a peace deal between the United States and the Russian Federation is utterly laughable. They have absolutely, at the risk of repeating myself too much, zero leverage in their dealings with the Trump regime. But as I indicated, things went south from there. So eventually, Alexander and Alex addressed the all-important question of why the Trump regime is engaging in this kabuki theater. And here's what they had to say.
That same question. Why do the Americans continue to discuss things with the Europeans and continue to discuss things with the Ukrainians in this way when the Ukrainians and the Europeans are simply going to act as spoilers, which is precisely what they are doing? Well, the only explanation is that the Trump administration understands and realizes that Ukraine still has enormous amounts of support in Washington itself. There's the Lindsey Graham, Mitch McConnell axis in the Senate, which has been getting stronger over the last couple of months. There have been the people in the deep state who have also been busy. We've had all those leaks that have been appearing in the media recently. We've had all of that commentary that's been all over the place in the media as well. And they still hope, therefore, to try to put pressure on the Ukrainians to give ground so that they can turn round to all of these critics in the United States and say to them, look, it's fine. We're able to move forward with the Russians because the Ukrainians have agreed. The Ukrainians have made those concessions.
All right. So this is just another way of articulating the theory that actually all of these commentators basically embrace. That poor Donald Trump, the president of peace, genuinely wants to bring an end to the Ukraine war, but it's those nasty neocons surrounding him, some of whom he appointed to those positions, who are getting in the way. What evidence there is to support that Trump's actually is, being isolated by them, and that he's serious about wanting an end to the Ukraine war. What evidence exists to back that up? I don't know. Someone has to show me something a little more convincing than Donald Trump's constant claims, the pathological liar saying over and over again how badly he wants peace. Why would anybody attach, any weight whatsoever to the claims of this man, this genocidal, psychopathic war criminal who has extraordinary difficulty being honest about the most simple propositions when his actions do not back up his words. And in fact, his actions contradict his words in every imaginable way. Now, Alexander Mercouris said in this piece that I just showed you that this is what he said, the only explanation for the Trump regime engaging in what they acknowledge as kabuki theater is that there's all this opposition in the deep state in Washington to a peace deal with Russia. And so they're trying to get the Ukrainians to go along so that the people who do have power, namely those who are in the deep state in the United States, will ultimately accede to this peace deal or some kind of peace deal with the Russian Federation. Now, I will grant Alexander and Alex that is a plausible interpretation. It's not implausible that that's what's going on here. But I think there's a much more plausible interpretation. Their interpretation certainly is not, as Alexander Mercouris claimed, the only possible explanation. There is another one staring us in the face, which I have been doing everything I can to raise for people's consideration. And that is that Donald Trump, when he was running to be the president of the United States, understood that there were a great many people in the United States who wanted the Ukraine war to be brought to an end and wanted to see the United States generally withdraw from forever wars and bring its troops home and spend a lot less money on these foreign military misadventures. He understood that perfectly well. It is indisputable. The polling evidence shows this beyond a shadow of a doubt, that there were many voters in the United States, and have been for quite some time, who wanted that from their president. And in order to win their votes, he lied. He did what politicians have been doing for centuries. Politicians lie to win people's votes. And so Donald Trump now has a political problem. And the political problem he has is that the MAGA base and other voters out there who might potentially vote for the Republicans in the upcoming midterms, for example, or in the next presidential election, are becoming increasingly disenchanted because this war is dragging on. And there is immense damage being done to the stability of relations with the Russian Federation, and this could escalate out of control. And so what Trump is doing in order to placate his base is he's putting on a show. I'm really trying hard, really, really trying to bring this to an end, but it's those nasty Europeans, those warmongering Europeans, and it's those those hard-headed Ukrainians. They simply can't be reasoned with. And, Vladimir Putin is being maximalist. He's demanding too much. I'm the innocent guy here. I'm the good guy. They're all the bad guys. They're the ones who are standing in the way. This is designed to do nothing more than convince American voters in the lead up to what are quite possibly going to be disastrous midterm elections next year, that Donald Trump actually is genuinely committed to peace, despite his, extraordinary warmongering in the Caribbean with respect to Venezuela, his war on Iran, his brutal attacks on Yemen, his full-throated support for this genocide in Gaza and for the destruction of South Lebanon, his saber rattling against the People's Republic of China, and on and on and on, my friends. That is who this man is. You are what your record says you are. But he wants people to believe otherwise, and so he's lying through his teeth about wanting this war to come to an end, and he has been from day one. That, too, is a plausible interpretation, Alexander Mercouris. And in fact, in my opinion, based on all the evidence, it's a lot more plausible than the interpretation that you have put forward. Now, if I'm right that Trump is lying about wanting peace in Ukraine, and if all of these commentators are wrong, And I admit it could be me that's wrong. I don't think so. But let's assume that I'm right and they're wrong. Why? Why are they clinging to this belief that Donald Trump genuinely wants peace in Ukraine and that the responsibility for the failure to secure it lies with others? And let me be clear, I don't think any one of these commentators is acting in bad faith. I think they genuinely believe that. I just think they're wrong. They've made an honest mistake. And what might be causing them to make that mistake? Well, one possibility is that, to be perfectly blunt, that their analytical skills aren't as strong as we thought they were. Personally, I don't accept that explanation. I think that all of these commentators have demonstrated consistently, not perfectly, but consistently, considerable analytical skill. So I don't think this is a question of competence at all. Number two, that deep down inside, even though they cling to this belief and they genuinely believe it, that Donald Trump wants to bring the Ukraine war to an end, at a certain level, subconsciously, they don't want to admit the truth because that would require them to acknowledge to their audience that they screwed up. When they promoted this claim, going all the way back to the election, that Donald Trump was really going to try to bring the Ukraine war to an end. Now, that's a possibility. But the one that I think is most likely to account for this mistake, which I believe they're making, is this: that there are aspects of Donald Trump's true agenda that they all like. May not be necessarily the same aspects, but there are aspects of his agenda that they like. And so when it comes to Donald Trump's bona fides with respect to the Ukraine war and the Russian Federation, they're pulling their punches because they want to see Donald Trump remain in power and have the ability to implement these other aspects of their agenda, of his agenda, that they favor. Maybe maybe, for example, they want much stricter control on illegal immigration. Maybe they want to see taxes lowered in the United States. If that's what you want, Donald Trump is definitely your man. If you want to see, harsh measures taken to prevent illegal immigration, extremely harsh measures, if you think not enough is being done to control that issue, Donald Trump is definitely your guy. Maybe you think that there's too much red tape in the United States government and it's, choking businesses, entrepreneurial spirit, and you want to see the regulatory regime gutted in the United States. Yeah, man, if that's what you want, Donald Trump is definitely the man for you. It could be other things, other aspects of his agenda. I don't know. At the end of the day, only they do. But I have heard some of these individuals make comments over time which suggest to me that there are certain aspects of Donald Trump's agenda that they favor. And therefore, it may be that they subconsciously are giving Donald Trump the benefit of the doubt on his peace initiative, even though all the evidence suggests that he doesn't deserve it. At the end of the day, I leave it to you to decide why they're getting this wrong and whether they're getting this wrong. I've simply expressed my view. I do, again, do this with the utmost respect for all of them. The key point here is that if they are wrong, and if Donald Trump does not want peace, but that matters to you, then this is a president whom you should not support, not in any way, shape, or form, and should call him out for his dishonesty. And to understand just how aggressive and violent this man is, consider this. Just as Trump was claiming that he was taking another shot at a peace deal with Russia, his Ukrainian vassal launched attacks on civilian vessels in the Black Sea. And here you can see a report from Al Jazeera published yesterday stating that a Russian flag tanker in the Black Sea was reported being attacked off the Turkish coast, the third such vessel to have been targeted within a week. The Turkish Directorate General of Maritime Affairs said on Tuesday that the Midvolga II had reported coming under attack about 130 miles from land. And apparently it was carrying, I believe it was canola oil. There's no evidence that it was carrying munitions or other weaponry or dual use items. And as this article indicates, 2 other tankers were attacked by Ukraine. These were alleged to be oil tankers from Russia's so-called shadow tanker fleet, and they were set ablaze with in the Black Sea by Ukrainian munitions and with severe impacts undoubtedly for the environment, and the crews had to be rescued. These are extremely provocative attacks, because they're attacks on civilian vessels. They meet the classic Western definition of terrorism. They are likely to elicit a harsh response from the Russian Federation, which continues to this very day, and increasingly so, to have escalation dominance over Ukraine. And I find it extremely difficult to believe that Zelensky would order his military to do this, or that senior Ukrainian military officials would do this without the consent, if not active support, of the Trump regime. Because, my friends, they are existentially dependent upon the United States. So the last thing they are going to want to do is enrage Donald Trump when he is purportedly seeking yet again to secure a peace in Ukraine by provoking Russia to engage in an escalation. My view is that it's highly likely that the US military and government knew of these attacks in advance, authorized them, and quite possibly supported them, facilitated the commission of these attacks. Why would they do that? Because they don't want peace. And they may well have been trying to pressure Russia to enter into a deal that it doesn't want to do, which effectively would amount to a temporary suspension of the hostilities, so that the Americans and the Europeans can rearm Ukraine and Ukraine can build up its army and its fortifications again. I think that's the most likely interpretation of what is going on here. But the idea that these provocative attacks occurred without the knowledge and approval of the United States government is quite frankly preposterous. So ultimately, Donald Trump, I'm afraid, will not end this war, nor will Zelensky or the Europeans. All of them, for their own selfish reasons, are going to keep this war going as long as they possibly can. The European leaders are going to keep it going because, amongst other reasons, the moment that they do a deal that the Russian Federation can accept, it will become apparent to everybody that Russia has won and that NATO has lost, and that they have been lied to for 4 years, everybody in Europe, I mean, and that they have been lied to for 4 years, and that they have expended hundreds of billions of euros for nothing, and have done extensive damage to their own economies for nothing, by depriving themselves of relatively inexpensive Russian energy. And once that realization sets in amongst broad swaths of European electorates, these politicians who supported this travesty, they are toast. They're done like dinner, and they will live in infamy thereafter. So they want to keep this thing going for as long as possible to avoid the day of reckoning. And I'm sure they'd like to put it off until they pass from this world to the afterlife, if that's even doable. In Zelensky's case, I think he wants to keep it going partly for that reason. If he were to agree now that to the terms that Russia has demanded, it would be clear that he committed a catastrophic blunder by not accepting the deal that was on the table in 2022, which would not have required Ukraine to cede any territory to the Russian Federation, and would have avoided the deaths and the wounding of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, possibly in excess of 1 million Ukrainians, not to mention massive destruction of Ukrainian infrastructure. I mean, the Ukrainian people will be simply enraged after all the maximalist statements and demands that Zelensky has made over the years. In addition, there are the far-right elements who are intensely hostile to peace with Russia, who might very well take his life. And finally, Zelensky is probably making out like a bandit from this war, absconding with massive amounts of money, and he just wants to keep the gravy train going. So Zelensky is never, ever going to agree, if he can avoid it, to this war coming to an end. And that leaves us, of course, with the Donald. Why would the Donald be determined to keep this war going? And the simple answer to that question is, first of all, the Donald, is beholden to the military-industrial complex, which is making out itself like a bandit from this depraved proxy war, and particularly military contractors. They love this proxy war. You can be sure of that. The Donald now is, he's convinced himself and is trying to convince Americans that he's enriching the American economy by getting the Europeans to pay for all of this weaponry that's going to Ukraine. But more than anything, the Donald is simply committed, psychopathically, frankly, to the notion of American global hegemony. He can't stand the idea that he's not the most powerful man in the world and that he can dominate everybody. And he wants to weaken Russia. He's completely on board with this project, has always been on board with this project, as Will Shriver demonstrated conclusively when he particularized in that report that we started this conversation with, all the things that Donald Trump did during his first administration to provoke Russia and to lead Ukraine into a disastrous proxy war. So at the end of the day, none of these characters is going to sit down at the table in good faith and deal with the legitimate demands of the Russian Federation. They will keep this gravy train going and this kabuki theater going for as long as they possibly can. And this is going to be resolved on the battlefield, sadly, tragically, above all for the Ukrainian people. And this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Toronto, Canada on December 3rd, 2025.